Usually, when you are dealing with something that's broken, say a smartphone that you just dropped on the pavement, and now the screen is completely shattered, there's a very clear expectation of how that gets fixed,
Oh, absolutely.
right? I mean, you take it to the repair shop, the technician takes out the screws, they swap out the broken glass for a pristine new display, you pay them, and then you just walk out.
Yeah, it's done.
Exactly. It's a binary event. 1 minute it is totally broken, and the next minute it's fully repaired and ready to go. And we are just deeply accustomed to that instant repair shop model in our daily lives.
Well, the appeal of that model is undeniable, you know. The transformation is highly visible, it happens almost immediately, and honestly, it provides a massive surge of psychological comfort
Oh, for
because
fact.
you identified a problem, you applied a targeted fix, and boom, the problem is gone.
But the friction really happens when you try to take that exact same instant repair model and apply it to human behavior or, personal growth or self-improvement.
Yeah, that is where things fall apart.
Right. You look at your own habits, you decide something is quote unquote broken, and you expect to wake up on January 1st, swap out your defective routines for pristine new ones, and just walk out the door as a brand new, highly optimized person.
And predictably, the screen just shatters all over again by January 12th.
Exactly. Every single time.
Because the fundamental biological reality here is that you just cannot overhaul a human life overnight. I mean, human brains are simply not wired to process or sustain massive, sudden behavioral overhauls.
They just reject it.
Completely. From an evolutionary standpoint, sudden, massive changes in your behavior or your environment, well, they usually signal danger or instability.
That makes sense, like a threat.
Exactly. Instead, we are neurologically designed for tiny, almost imperceptible incremental adaptations over very long periods of time.
And that biological reality is really the core foundation of today's deep dive. We are looking at the literal science of habit formation for you, the listener, and those microscopic 30-second choices that actually have the power to rewrite your neural pathways.
Because relying on raw willpower is just a guaranteed path to failure.
Right, so we are taking a massive amount of clinical guidance, academic critiques, workplace safety data, and behavioral psychology, and we're synthesizing it into a practical, scientifically backed operating manual for your own brain.
Which is so desperately needed, honestly.
It is because, like you said, relying on fleeting motivation to change your life just does not work. Motivation is an incredibly unreliable energy source.
It really is. Motivation operates much like a sudden spike in adrenaline.
Like a sugar rush.
Basically, yeah. It is fantastic for short, intense bursts of effort, like running from a predator or, pulling an all-nighter to finish a crucial project for work.
Right.
But you cannot run your daily existence on adrenaline. And you certainly cannot run your long-term habits on motivation. The fuel just burns way too fast.
So what happens when that fuel runs out?
Well, when the motivation inevitably dissipates, you are left entirely with your baseline systems. And if those baseline systems are broken, the new behavior collapses immediately.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit, because we've all heard the cliche that you need to be consistent,
Yeah.
right? Every self-help blog on the internet yells at you to wake up at 4 in the morning, plunge into a tub of ice water, run a half marathon, and then drink a kale smoothie before the sun even comes up.
The info overload is real.
It's exhausting. It feels like this impossible mountain of action. But the literature suggests we fundamentally misunderstand how progress is actually generated. Like, progress doesn't actually require massive action at all.
No, it doesn't. The literature heavily emphasizes that progress requires massive consistency in seemingly insignificant actions.
Seemingly insignificant.
Right. And this brings us to the core concept of the micro-habit. The clinical sources we're analyzing today, they focus on actions that are so incredibly small. We are talking about behaviors that take roughly 30 to 90 seconds to complete.
Less than a minute.
Exactly. And the beauty of a 30-second action is that it completely bypasses the brain's natural resistance to high-effort tasks.
I want to dig into that resistance for a second, because I think everyone listening right now knows that feeling of absolute dread when they look at a massive to-do list. Why does the brain fight us so incredibly hard when we decide, hey, I want to start working out for an hour a day?
Well, you have to remember that the brain is essentially an energy management machine.
Right.
It consumes a massive portion of your daily caloric intake just to keep your organs functioning and your thoughts processing. So when you consciously tell yourself, I'm going to do a grueling 1-hour workout today, the brain immediately calculates that projected energy expenditure.
It does the math.
It does the math, and it perceives that high-effort task as a potential threat to your core energy reserves.
Wow, a literal threat.
Yeah, a biological threat.
Uh-huh.
So to protect those reserves, it actively triggers feelings of procrastination, lethargy, or acute dread. It is literally trying to talk you out of spending the energy.
That explains so much about my Sunday mornings.
Right. But when you say, hey, I am going to do just 5 squats, the brain calculates the energy costs, realizes it's completely negligible, and it just doesn't bother triggering the defense mechanism.
So the micro-habit slips right past the guards.
Exactly. It slips right past.
So the mathematician and author James Clear breaks down the power of slipping past those guards with a mathematical principle regarding how habits compound.
The 1% rule.
Yes. If you get just 1% better every day, you don't just get 365% better over the course of a year, because human behavior compounds, exactly like interest in a bank account.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. A 1% daily improvement actually makes you 37.78 times better by the end of a single year.
37 times.
The math is staggering. But honestly, I've tried doing the small things. I've tried running just a single mile a day. And after a month, I didn't feel 37 times better. I didn't look any different in the mirror. I just felt tired, and I ended up quitting. So why does the math feel like a total lie when you actually put it into practice?
Yeah, that is such a common frustration. The disconnect between the math and your personal experience is due to a psychological trap that Clear calls the plateau of latent potential.
The plateau of latent potential.
Right. Though in the behavioral psychology community, it's often more colloquially referred to as the valley of disappointment.
The valley of disappointment.
Yeah.
That perfectly describes the month of February for about 90% of people who set New Year's resolutions.
It really does.
What is actually happening in the brain during that valley? Why does it feel so bad?
Well, the most powerful outcomes of any compounding process are heavily, heavily delayed. But humans are conditioned to expect linear progress.
Meaning one-to-one.
Exactly. If you put in 1 unit of effort, you expect to see 1 unit of visible result. You put in 10 units, you want 10 units of result.
Sure, that makes logical sense.
It does. But compounding habits do not work linearly. They curve. So when you start making those 1% improvements, the early results are functionally invisible.
Invisible.
Totally invisible. You put in the work for a week, then a month, maybe 2 months, and the external results remain entirely flat. You think, I have been running every single day for 3 weeks. Why hasn't the scale moved?
Right, why don't I have more energy?
Exactly. That painful gap between the linear progress you logically expect to see and the delayed compounding progress that is actually happening beneath the surface, that gap is the valley of disappointment.
But the literature emphasizes that the daily effort you are putting in during that valley isn't being wasted, right?
Not at all.
The effort is being stored, like it's accumulating potential energy.
Yes, stored energy.
And when you finally cross a critical threshold, all of those previous actions just culminate in a massive visible breakthrough. And to the outside world, the people who didn't see the months of invisible work in the valley, it looks like you are an overnight success.
Which is why overnight successes are a myth. Navigating that valley is undeniably the hardest part of habit formation.
Yeah, I can see why.
Because if you are entirely focused on the external outcome, say, the number on the scale or the amount of money in the savings account, the valley of disappointment will break your resolve every single time.
Because the reward isn't there.
Exactly. The outcome just isn't materializing fast enough to provide that hit of dopamine. This is why the sources insist on shifting the focus away from the outcome and redirecting it entirely toward your identity.
Okay, we've all heard the bumper sticker version of this, right? Don't focus on the goal. Focus on being the type of person who achieves the goal.
Right, which sounds a bit cheesy.
It does. It sounds a bit like corporate motivational speak. But from a strict neurological standpoint, why does an identity shift actually alter our daily behavior more effectively than just staring at a specific goal?
Because goals are tied to a specific finite endpoint. Like, I want to read 50 books this year, or I want to lose 20 pounds. That is an outcome-based framing. And the neurological fragility of an outcome-based goal is that the moment the outcome feels too difficult, too far away, or simply inconvenient, the behavior associated with it collapses. The brain simply decides the reward isn't worth the immediate friction. But identity-based framing focuses entirely on who you wish to become, regardless of the endpoint.
So the focus shifts from, I want to read 50 books to, I am a reader.
Exactly. The focus shifts from, I want to run a marathon, to I am a runner.
It's basically the difference between cramming for a test and moving to a foreign country.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. Like focusing on an outcome-based goal is like cramming for a high school Spanish exam. You brute force the vocabulary into your short-term memory, you pass the test on Friday, and by Monday morning, you have completely forgotten how to conjugate the verbs.
Because the goal was achieved. The threat of the test is gone.
Exactly. It's a temporary behavioral retention based on a temporary external goal. But an identity-based shift is like packing up and actually moving to Spain.
You have to adapt.
Yeah, you aren't just memorizing flashcards for a test anymore. You are fundamentally adapting to a new environment until speaking Spanish is no longer a task you perform, but an intrinsic part of who you are. It becomes a permanent adaptation.
And the permanence of that adaptation is the whole key. If you successfully build the identity of, I am someone who prioritizes hydration, well, you no longer need to force yourself to drink 64 ounces of water through sheer willpower.
You just do it.
You simply drink water because that is the default action of a hydrated person. Your identity naturally emerges out of your habits. Every single micro action you take is essentially a vote cast for the type of person you wish to become.
The clinical source we have from Calendoc actually provides some brilliantly simple examples of casting these votes. They suggest doing literally 5 squats before you step into the shower.
Just 5.
Or reading just one single page of a book before you turn off the lamp at night. And on the surface, honestly, those actions sound almost embarrassingly easy.
But they must be easy. If they require significant effort, the brain's defense mechanisms will block them, like we talked about.
Right, the energy calculation.
Exactly. The primary objective isn't the physical benefit of the 5 squats. I mean, 5 squats won't build massive muscle.
Right.
The objective is casting a neurological vote that says, I am the type of person who prioritizes physical movement. And once you begin casting those tiny, effortless votes, you trigger a really fascinating psychological cascade known as the ditto effect.
Now, the ditto effect is usually talked about in the context of out-of-control consumer spending, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like the spiral of consumption.
It is, yeah. Historically, the ditto effect describes how obtaining one new possession frequently creates a spiral of consumption that leads you to acquire even more possessions.
So you buy a new, modern sofa for your living room.
Right, and suddenly your old rug looks incredibly worn out and out of place next to the new sofa, so you go buy a new rug.
And then the coffee table looks wrong, so you replace that.
Exactly. One action forces the environment to demand further action. But behavioral psychology shows we can actually hijack that exact same spiral for positive habit formation.
So applying that to the microhabit, you perform the habit of doing 5 squats before the shower. And that tiny burst of movement makes you feel slightly more energized.
Just slightly.
Right. And because you feel energized, you instinctively crave a glass of cold water instead of, say, a sugary soda with your breakfast.
The spiral begins.
And because you avoided the sugar crash, you have better focus at work, which reduces your stress, which ultimately helps you sleep better that night.
Yes.
One tiny positive action creates a literal vacuum that pulls other positive actions into your day.
It's a positive ditto spiral.
But, okay, I want to push back on the biology here for a second, because conceptually, I understand casting a vote for my identity. It makes psychological sense. But if these habits are genuinely that tiny, I mean, reading a single page, doing squats for 30 seconds, how do they actually physically rewrite human biology? Like, how does something that takes less than a minute fundamentally alter the physical architecture of the brain?
That is the big question. To understand the physical restructuring of the brain, we have to look at the literal neuroscience of how tiny actions become automatic reflexes. And the literature points us to a landmark 2007 Oxford University study concerning a biological process called synaptic pruning.
And the parameters of that Oxford study are totally counterintuitive to everything we assume about intelligence and aging.
Very much so.
The researchers looked at the physical brain structures of newborn babies, and they compared them directly to the brains of average adults. And they revealed that an average newborn baby actually has 41% more neurons than an average fully developed adult.
Which just sounds completely backward.
It does. You would naturally assume that an adult who has, learned how to drive a car, file taxes, speak a language, that they would possess significantly more neural connections than an infant who literally can't even hold its own head up.
Well, the logic seems inverted until you view it strictly through the lens of biological efficiency.
Can I explain that?
Think of a newborn infant's brain as this impossibly dense, overgrown jungle of potential. Literally every possible neural connection exists, allowing the infant the potential to learn any language or adapt to any environment on Earth.
Infinite potential.
Exactly. But maintaining that massive network of neurons requires an exorbitant amount of caloric energy. And as the child ages and interacts with their specific environment, the brain realizes it simply cannot afford to waste precious energy maintaining connections that are never, ever utilized.
So it engages in synaptic pruning.
Exactly.
The brain is essentially acting like a ruthless accountant cutting budget deficits.
That's a perfect way to put it. It actively prunes away the synapses. Those are the connections between neurons that do not receive regular electrical stimulation. And simultaneously, it heavily fortifies and insulates the specific connections that are triggered frequently.
It sacrifices infinite potential in exchange for high-speed efficiency in the skills actually required for survival.
Precisely. So, if you force yourself to sit down and practice the piano for 10 minutes every single day, the brain recognizes that repetitive electrical pattern. It essentially paves a high-speed, heavily insulated neurological superhighway for those specific motor functions and auditory processing centers.
But if you never attempt to juggle, the brain actively prunes away the dormant pathways that would have been used for juggling, because maintaining them is just a waste of calories.
Yes, and this relentless biological drive for neurological efficiency is the exact mechanism you are exploiting when you utilize a behavioral technique known as habit stacking.
Habit stacking. Now, this feels like the ultimate biological cheat code. The formula is incredibly straightforward, right? It's just, after my current habit, I will perform my new habit.
Right. And the genius of habit stacking is that you are not asking your brain to construct a brand new neural pathway from scratch in the middle of nowhere.
Because building a new pathway requires immense willpower and glucose.
Exactly. Instead, you are identifying a robust, deeply entrenched neurological superhighway that already exists, and you are grafting your new fragile behavior directly onto it.
Okay, so imagine your adult brain as a really dense forest. Over the years, your established daily routines, turning on the coffee maker, brushing your teeth, locking the front door before you leave, those have become wide, paved highways cutting straight through the center of that forest.
The brain travels down those specific highways on autopilot.
Right. So trying to build a new habit using only motivations like grabbing a machete, stepping off the paved highway, and trying to bushwhack a brand new trail through thick thorns and underbrush.
It's exhausting.
It's exhausting. And you will eventually just give up and go back to the highway.
Always.
But habit stacking is simply building a tiny 30-second off-ramp attached directly to the existing paved highway.
That is exactly what it is physically doing in the brain. Your brain already knows exactly how to navigate the process of making morning coffee without you having to consciously deliberate over every single step. It is a completely automatic sequence.
So you hijack the momentum of that automatic sequence.
Yes. You tell yourself, after I push the button to pour my coffee, I will stand there and meditate for 60 seconds.
You use the physical completion of the old habit as the unavoidable trigger for the new habit.
Yes.
And you can continuously chain these together into really complex routines, correct?
Oh, absolutely. You can build highly effective sequences by using the momentum of the preceding action. So a morning stack might flow like this. After I push the button on the coffee maker, I will meditate for 60 seconds. After I complete the 60 seconds of meditation, I will pick up my pen and write down my top 3 tasks for the day. After I write down my tasks, I will immediately open my laptop and begin the first task.
Wow, so the sequence becomes a single fluid neurological motion rather than 4 separate difficult hurdles.
Exactly. It all becomes one highway.
But the behavioral data is incredibly clear that there is a massive point of failure here if you allow any ambiguity into the stack.
Oh, ambiguity ruins it.
You cannot formulate a stack by saying, well, when I take my lunch break today, I will do some exercise.
Right, because ambiguity is the absolute enemy of habit formation. The brain operates on precise cues. Taking a lunch break is just a vague block of time. It's not a specific, actionable cue.
The brain doesn't know what to do with that.
No, your brain doesn't know exactly when the trigger occurs. Like, does the break start when you stand up, when you open the fridge, when you sit on the couch?
Right.
To effectively graft a new behavior, the cue must be highly specific and deeply physical. Instead of a vague intention, you dictate a precise physical trigger.
For example,
when I physically close the lid of my laptop for lunch, I will immediately drop to the floor and do 10 push-ups next to my desk.
the physical act of the laptop closing is the undeniable neurological trigger.
Exactly. There's no room for debate.
So we understand the internal mechanics now. We know the brain is ruthlessly pruning away unused connections and paving superhighways for the habits we repeat. And we know we can hijack those superhighways through precise habit stacking.
Right.
But creating and maintaining a path isn't strictly an internal mental game. It is heavily dictated by the external physical reality surrounding that path. Because if your environment is hostile, the internal wiring really struggles to execute.
The external reality dictates the friction of the behavior, and this transitions us beautifully into the overarching framework known as the 4 laws of behavior change.
Okay, the 4 laws.
Right. To build the lasting habit, you must alter your environment to adhere to 4 specific principles. You need to make the cue obvious, make the behavior attractive, make the action easy, and make the completion satisfying.
Obvious, attractive, easy, satisfying.
Yes. And the foundational philosophy underpinning all 4 of these laws is known as the law of least effort.
The law of least effort, which honestly feels like a very polite psychological term for the fact that human beings are fundamentally lazy.
Well, effectively, yes.
I mean, given a choice between 2 paths, we almost always naturally gravitate toward the option that requires the least amount of physical or cognitive work.
It's how we survive.
So rather than relying on raw self-control to force yourself down the harder path, which just drains your cognitive reserves anyway, you should focus entirely on environment design.
Because relying on self-control is a short-term, high-energy strategy that is completely guaranteed to fail over a long enough timeline. Environment design is the long-term, low-energy solution.
Give me an example of that.
Consider dietary habits. If your goal is to eat healthier, but the counters in your kitchen are constantly covered in processed junk food, well, you are forcing your brain to engage in active combat with your environment every single time you walk into the room.
You have to expend willpower just to say no to the cookies.
Every single time. But environment design means completely removing the junk food from the physical space so that the default, easiest, most obvious action is eating the bowl of apples on the counter.
You literally don't need willpower if the environment makes the good choice the only easy choice.
Exactly.
The academic review from the International Journal of Social Impact really dissects this concept of environment design, and they highlight some heavy-hitting psychological frameworks that prove why making things obvious and easy is so vital.
Yes, they do.
They explore the work of psychologist Peter Goldwitzer and his concept of the implementation intention.
Goldwitzer's research is a huge cornerstone of behavioral science. Implementation intention is basically the formal psychological mechanism behind predicting and preloading your decisions.
Preloading?
Right. The formal equation is, if situation X occurs, I will automatically perform action Y. It goes way beyond simple habit stacking by actively anticipating environmental cues and deciding your response before the situation ever even arises.
But why does preloading a decision matter so much? Like, why can't I just logically decide to do the right thing when the moment actually happens?
Because making decisions in real time requires significant cognitive load and glucose from the prefrontal cortex.
And we are running out of that all day long.
Exactly. If you wait until 6 o'clock in the evening after a long, exhausting day of work to decide whether or not you are going to go to the gym, your prefrontal cortex is already entirely depleted.
Right.
The law of least effort will absolutely take over and you'll just sit on the couch. But an implementation intention removes the need for a real-time decision. You say, if it is 6 o'clock on Tuesday, I am walking through the doors of the gym.
The decision was made hours ago when your energy was high.
Yes. You are simply executing a preloaded script, completely bypassing the depleted decision-making centers of the brain.
That is brilliant. Now, the review also examines another behavioral framework called the Premack principle, named after psychologist David Premack. And the academic paper affectionately refers to this as Grandma's rule.
Grandma's rule is a concept everyone understands instinctively. You must eat all of your broccoli before you are allowed to have a slice of chocolate cake.
The classic rule.
In clinical behavioral psychology, the Premack principle dictates that a less preferred, high-friction behavior can be effectively reinforced by using the opportunity to engage in a highly preferred, low-friction behavior as a reward directly afterward.
So you intentionally withhold the high probability behavior to pull yourself through the low probability behavior.
Exactly. You use the anticipation of the reward as the engine to drive the work.
That sounds incredibly similar to another concept the literature brings up, which is Captain Milkman's strategy of temptation bundling. But how does temptation bundling actually differ from Grandma's rule? Are they just two different names for the same psychological trick?
It is a subtle but really vital distinction regarding timing.
Timing.
Right. The Premack principle is strictly sequential. You must suffer through the hard thing first, and then you receive the reward.
Broccoli, then cake.
Yes. Temptation bundling, however, is simultaneous. You combine an activity you deeply need to do with an activity you deeply love to do, and you perform them at the exact same time.
Oh, okay.
The classic example is only allowing yourself to listen to your absolute favorite true crime podcast while you are physically running on the treadmill.
Ah, so you are literally bundling the temptation with the friction. You cannot access the dopamine of the podcast without enduring the physical exertion of the treadmill.
Exactly. The two become inextricably linked in the brain.
But, the academic review doesn't just stop at how we organize our physical spaces or how we bundle our tasks. It brings up social norms, heavily referencing Albert Bandura's social learning theory.
Very important stuff.
It points out that we are not just designing our living rooms. Our behavior is massively dictated by our social environment. The data shows we consistently imitate the habits of three specific groups: the close, the many, and the powerful.
Because humans are deeply social, herd-oriented animals, our brains are strictly hardwired to view social conformity as a survival mechanism.
Conformity keeps you in the tribe.
Right, so if you purposefully inject yourself into a social group where your desired behavior is already the established normal behavior, well, building the habit becomes nearly effortless. If you want to read more, joining a book club forces the habit because the social pressure pulls you along.
Right.
As the behavioral adage goes, on any given day, human beings would much rather be wrong while standing with the crowd than be right while standing entirely by themselves.
It's powerful. But I have to stop you there and push back on this purely individualistic narrative that permeates so much of the self-improvement world.
Let's hear it.
The core philosophy here seems to be the active designer of your world and not merely a passive consumer of it. But if our physical and social environments dictate our behavior as heavily as the science suggests, what happens when a listener's socioeconomic reality is actively hostile to these changes?
That is the big catch.
Right, because it is very easy to say, oh, put your phone in another room to avoid distraction if you live in a large, comfortable house and control your own schedule. But what if a listener is working 3 different jobs just to pay rent, and they're sharing a tiny apartment with 5 extended family members in a collectivist culture where family obligations constantly supersede individual routines?
You're absolutely right to bring this up.
The International Journal of Social Impact specifically calls this out as a massive blind spot in behavior change literature.
And it is a highly valid, critical analysis of the literature. It is a point the journal addresses directly. The academic critique notes that a vast majority of self-help and habit formation literature suffers from a distinct Western individualistic bias.
A huge bias.
The literature frequently operates on the underlying assumption that the reader possesses total autonomy over their time, complete control over their physical living space, and the financial resources to just endlessly optimize their surroundings.
Which is just not reality for most people.
Not at all. It largely ignores the friction of systemic barriers, unpredictable shift work, socioeconomic limitations, or the deep-rooted, non-negotiable family obligations that are really central to collectivist cultures.
Right, because you cannot simply design your optimal environment if you don't even have sovereignty over the room you sleep in.
Precisely. Acknowledging this bias is not about providing an excuse for inaction. It is about applying a necessary, highly realistic lens to the science. For someone navigating heavy systemic barriers or a truly chaotic external environment design is no longer just a fun, theoretical life hack for productivity.
Right.
It becomes a vital, deeply necessary defense mechanism. You may not possess the autonomy to control your overarching socioeconomic environment or your work schedule, but you must fiercely and aggressively control the microenvironments you do have access to.
I love that framing. If the external world is chaotic and entirely outside of your control, you have to relentlessly fortify your internal biological environment. You have to ensure that the foundational systems running your brain are as resilient as possible. And if we are looking for the absolute bedrock of biological resilience, the system that dictates whether any of these behavioral laws can even be implemented at all, we have to examine sleep.
Sleep is the non-negotiable biological foundation required for literally every single concept we have discussed so far.
Everything.
Everything. All of that miraculous neuroplasticity we talked about, the synaptic pruning where the brain clears out old pathways and paves new ones, the executive function and willpower required to execute an implementation intention at 6 o'clock at night.
None of it works without sleep.
None of those mechanisms function properly if the brain is deprived of adequate sleep. Sleep is when the physical maintenance of the brain actually occurs.
So we have clinical guidance from Healthline detailing 12 specific tips for better sleep hygiene. But, I don't want to just list the tips because everyone already knows they should get better sleep.
We've all heard the lists.
Right. The disconnect happens because people don't understand the mechanisms. When you understand the biological why behind the rule, it stops being a polite suggestion and becomes a physical necessity.
Exactly.
For instance, Healthline explicitly states the optimal sleeping temperature for a bedroom is between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Why such an incredibly narrow, specific window?
Well, the temperature recommendation is tied directly to the mechanical function of your circadian rhythm. To transition from wakefulness to deep sleep, your core body temperature actually needs to drop by a few degrees.
Your core temperature has to drop.
Yes. A cooler room actively facilitates that natural, necessary drop in core body temperature. When the ambient air cools your body, it sends a powerful, undeniable biological signal to your brain that the day is over and it is time to literally shut down the central nervous system.
And if the room is too hot?
If the room is too warm, your body struggles to vent that heat, it completely fails to achieve that required temperature drop, and your brain remains in a state of physiological alertness, which leads to hours of just tossing and turning.
Wow. And then there's the most repeated rule of the modern era, right? Avoid screens and electronics before bed. We all know staring at a phone in the dark is, quote-unquote, bad for us. But what is the actual biological mechanism that makes it so destructive to our sleep architecture?
The destructive mechanism is the suppression of melatonin via blue light.
Melatonin suppression.
Right. Melatonin is the master hormone responsible for regulating your entire sleep-wake cycle. For hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, our brains relied entirely on the setting of the sun and the fading of natural light to trigger the mass production of melatonin in the pineal gland.
Okay, the sun goes down, melatonin goes up.
Exactly. But the highly concentrated blue light emitted by the LED screens on our smartphones, tablets, and laptops, it perfectly mimics the exact frequency of intense daylight. So when you are staring at a screen at 11 o'clock at night, that concentrated blue light hits the retinas at the back of your eyes, and it sends a massive signal to the brain, completely halting the production of melatonin.
You are actively injecting daylight into your nervous system.
Yes. Your brain genuinely, chemically believes the sun is still up, which completely shatters your circadian rhythm.
We are essentially fighting millions of years of evolutionary programming with a glowing rectangle.
It's a losing battle.
Let's look at the chemical side of alertness, specifically caffeine. Because the Healthline data points out that the effects of a single cup of coffee can linger in your system for up to 8 hours. How does caffeine actually interact with the brain's sleep signals?
So caffeine has a remarkably long half-life in the human body, but the way it keeps you awake is often deeply misunderstood. Caffeine does not actively provide you with new energy.
It doesn't.
No, it operates as a receptor blocker.
A blocker.
Right. Throughout your waking hours, your brain naturally produces a neurotransmitter called adenosine. And adenosine steadily builds up in the brain all day long, binding to specific receptors and creating what we call sleep pressure.
Sleep pressure, which is the physical feeling of being tired.
Exactly. When you consume caffeine, the caffeine molecules physically bind to those exact same adenosine receptors, blocking the adenosine from attaching.
So the adenosine is still there.
The adenosine is still building up in the background. Your brain simply cannot feel it anymore because the receptors are blocked by the caffeine. So if you drink a cup of coffee at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a massive portion of that caffeine is still securely attached to those receptors at midnight, artificially blinding your brain to its own exhaustion.
So when the caffeine finally metabolizes and detaches from the receptors, all of that accumulated adenosine just floods the system all at once.
Which is exactly why we experience a massive crash.
That makes so much sense. Now, the clinical guidance also heavily emphasizes environment design when it comes to the bedroom itself. They state that your mattress must be mentally associated only with sleep and intimacy. No reading work emails, no watching television, no scrolling through social media while lying under the covers.
This brings us right back to the brain's heavy reliance on specific environmental cues and neurological associations. The brain is a pattern recognition machine.
Right. The superhighways.
Yes. If you routinely bring your laptop into bed to answer stressful work emails, your brain rapidly forms a powerful association between the physical mattress and feelings of stress, professional anxiety, and high cognitive alertness.
So the bed literally becomes a trigger for stress.
You are literally severing the neurological link between your bed and the concept of relaxation. The bed becomes a cue for the fight or flight response.
That completely explains the anxiety spike so many people feel the exact moment their head hits the pillow.
It's a learned response.
And the Healthline sources also mention keeping daytime naps strictly under 20 minutes to avoid entering deep sleep cycles. And the CDC heavily recommends getting at least 30 minutes of direct morning sunlight outside to properly anchor your circadian clock for the day.
Both crucial habits.
But I have to ask you about the most frustrating sleep dilemma of all. The lay in bed awake scenario.
Oh, yes.
Every single listener knows this agonizing feeling. It is 2 in the morning, you are staring blankly at the ceiling, and you're doing the desperate mental math of how many hours of sleep you will get if you manage to fall asleep right this second.
The worst feeling.
Should you just lie there, squeeze your eyes shut, and try to brute force yourself into unconsciousness?
Absolutely not. The clinical consensus strongly advises against forcing it. If you are lying in bed, you are not feeling tired, and you have not fallen asleep within roughly 20 minutes, you must physically get up and leave the bedroom.
Wait, leave the room entirely, even at 2 in the morning?
You must leave the room. If you choose to stay in bed, tossing and turning, actively frustrated by your inability to sleep, you are rapidly training your brain to associate the mattress with the emotions of anxiety, failure, and wakefulness.
Oh, I see.
It becomes a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The clinical protocol is to get out of bed, move to a dimly lit room, and engage in a low-stimulation activity, like reading a physical paper book or doing some light stretching.
No phones.
You absolutely do not look at a screen. You only return to the bedroom when you feel genuine, heavy sleepiness. You have to aggressively protect the mental association that the bed is solely a place for unconsciousness.
If optimized sleep hygiene provides the foundational baseline for the brain to recover and prune its neural pathways, our next physiological habit focuses on the literal physical medium through which those neural pathways communicate during our waking hours.
Yes.
And that medium is water.
Proper hydration. This is an area of human physiology where the general public drastically and dangerously underestimates the immediate cognitive impact.
We are analyzing data provided by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, alongside research from a hydration science company called Swincher. Usually when the average person thinks about hydration, they frame it entirely as a physical sports-related issue, you know?
By sports drinks and athletes.
Exactly. You need water because you're sweating, or to prevent a muscle cramp during a run, or to regulate body heat. But this data focuses heavily on how profoundly cognitive the hydration process is. The human brain is comprised of 73% water.
That is a staggering percentage of total mass. It highlights the reality that the delicate balance between water molecules and other elemental electrolytes in your brain cells is the true foundation of cognitive function.
Right.
When you become dehydrated, even mildly, that delicate balance is instantly disrupted. The cells essentially lose their structural and chemical efficiency, resulting in a measurable degradation of brain function.
And the specific cognitive failures that OSHA and the data highlight are incredibly concerning for anyone just trying to get through a normal workday. They note that even mild dehydration significantly impairs your short-term memory. It actively makes it difficult to retrieve long-term memories, and it severely degrades your prefrontal cortex's ability to perform basic mental arithmetic.
It's frightening.
If you are sitting at your desk at 2 in the afternoon, struggling to hold a few numbers in your head or just remember the point of an email, you might not be suffering from mental fatigue at all. You might literally just be dehydrated.
And the cognitive degradation goes far beyond just memory retention and processing speed. The data reveals a surprising and deeply physiological link between hydration levels and emotional mood regulation.
Yes. The studies show that individuals who report feeling thirsty perform significantly worse on cognitive reaction time tests, but they also report higher levels of irritability and tension. But why does a lack of water in the digestive system translate to feeling psychologically depressed or tense?
It ultimately comes down to cardiovascular mechanics and the flow of oxygen.
Okay, break that down.
When your body's dehydrated, your overall blood volume actually decreases. Because there is less water in the blood becomes physically thicker and more viscous.
Oh, wow. Thicker blood.
Yes. This thicker blood means your heart has to work significantly harder, pumping with more force, just to push the blood through your vessels and deliver the necessary oxygen to your vital organs. Most importantly, your brain.
Oh, so your heart is literally straining.
Yes. That slight decrease in optimal oxygen flow, combined with the physical stress of the heart working overtime, triggers a massive physiological stress response. Your sympathetic nervous system interprets this physical strain as anxiety or danger, which manifests psychologically as feelings of grogginess, tension, unexplained confusion, and even symptoms that perfectly mimic clinical depression.
That is terrifying. The physical friction of your heart pumping thickened blood directly translates into a psychological feeling of tension and anxiety.
Exactly.
So knowing how critical this is, what are the actual data-backed guidelines for daily hydration? We always hear the old 8 glasses of water a day rule, but that seems incredibly arbitrary.
Well, the 8 glasses rule is outdated and unscientific because it completely ignores body mass. A more accurate, personalized physiological guideline provided by the sources is to aim for 1 cup of water for every 20 pounds of body weight per day.
1 cup per 20 pounds.
So a person weighing 160 pounds should be aiming for approximately 8 cups, while a 200-pound person requires significantly more to maintain that 73% ratio in the brain.
And the data shows that it does not take a massive amount of water to reverse the cognitive decline. They cite a specific clinical study where researchers gave dehydrated subjects a mere 330 milliliters of water.
Which is just a little over 1 standard cup.
Right, and that single cup of water drastically and almost immediately improved the subject's performance on visual sustained attention tests when compared directly to the control group.
It acts as instant cognitive fuel. You are literally reinflating the cells and thinning the blood to restore optimal oxygen delivery.
So bringing this back to the listener, what does all of this physiological data mean for the person sitting in a cubicle staring at a spreadsheet? It means that keeping a full water bottle on your desk isn't just a generic health box to lazily tick off for your physical wellness. It is a real-time, highly effective cognitive enhancer.
A mandatory one.
And the data issues a stark warning. If you wait until your throat feels dry and you consciously feel the sensation of thirst, you are already way too late.
Far too late.
Thirst is not a polite reminder from your body to drink. Thirst is a biological alarm bell, indicating that your reaction time has already slowed down, your blood has already thickened, and your cognitive efficiency is already degraded.
Hydration must be viewed as proactive cognitive maintenance, not a reactive physical cure.
Let's follow the logical progression here. Once the physical brain is properly rested through optimized sleep hygiene, and the neural pathways are fully hydrated, allowing oxygen and neurotransmitters to flow efficiently, we have built the perfect biological foundation.
We have the hardware running optimally.
Right. Now we can move to the ultimate micro-habit for mental wellness, a habit that utilizes all of this biological foundation to literally, physically reshape the brain structures associated with happiness and emotional regulation.
We are entering the clinical science of gratitude.
We are pulling from research provided by IE University, alongside the clinical mental wellness guidelines from St. Luke's Bend Foundation. And I really want to start by clarifying exactly what we mean when we say gratitude. Because Dr. Robert Emmons, one of the world's leading academic researchers on the psychology of gratitude, defines it very specifically.
It's not just a polite word.
Exactly. It is not just politely saying thank you when someone holds a door open. Dr. Emmons defines gratitude as a rigorous, 2-part cognitive process. First, it requires actively acknowledging that goodness, in some form, exists in the world around you. Second, and most importantly, it requires recognizing that the primary source of this goodness lies outside of yourself.
That second component is the neurological key. By forcing the brain to recognize an external source of goodness, you actively break the deeply ingrained toxic loop of self-rumination.
When you just obsess over your own problems.
Right. When people are stressed, their thoughts spiral inward, obsessing over their own perceived failures. Gratitude forces the perspective outward. The sources break this intentional practice down into a framework called the 4 A's: awareness, acknowledgement, acceptance, and action.
Awareness, acknowledgement, acceptance, action.
Yes. First, you must train your brain to have the awareness to spot the positive elements in your environment. Then, you actively acknowledge their specific value to your life. You accept that good thing without suspicion or the urge to immediately find the catch. And finally, you take action by physically expressing that gratitude, either by writing it down or speaking it to someone else.
I really want to emphasize the hard neuroscience behind this, because in popular culture, gratitude is often just dismissed as warm, fuzzy, self-help nonsense.
Which is a huge mistake.
It is.
Yeah.
But practicing those 4A's actively strengthens highly specific neural pathways. When researchers put subjects in MRI machines and have them practice deep gratitude, the scans show immense electrical activity lighting up the hippocampus, which is the brain center responsible for processing and storing memories.
Right.
And the amygdala, which is the alarm bell of the brain responsible for regulating intense emotion and fear, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles complex decision-making, logical processing, and empathy.
Because the brain operates on the principle of neuroplasticity. By repeatedly activating those specific areas with grateful, outward-focused thoughts, you are physically fortifying them, making them significantly more resilient to future stress. Furthermore, the practice triggers the brain to instantly boost the production of dopamine and serotonin.
The feel-good chemicals.
Exactly. The primary neurotransmitters responsible for making us feel calm, focused, and emotionally stabilized.
And while it is boosting the positive neurotransmitters, gratitude is simultaneously suppressing the production of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. It forces the body to disengage the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, and actively engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest state.
This is exactly why gratitude is the ultimate master key for behavior change. If we connect this back to the broader picture of our deep dive today, look at the comprehensive lists of life-changing daily habits we gathered from our sources. We have a list of 20 crucial habits from Loving Life and 10 fundamental habits from Anytime Fitness. They suggest implementing complex behaviors like setting firm personal boundaries, learning how to say no to toxic people, to taking cold showers, and meticulously managing your time.
All of which are incredibly demanding, high-friction behavioral changes.
They are deeply demanding because they require immense emotional regulation and executive function. You cannot successfully integrate emotionally volatile habits like setting boundaries with a toxic boss or learning to say no to family members if your brain is currently locked in a high cortisol fight-or-flight stress loop.
You just can't do it.
Your amygdala will panic and force you to conform to the social pressure immediately. Gratitude is the biological prerequisite for those harder habits. By practicing gratitude, you suppress the cortisol stress loop, unlock the prefrontal cortex, and create the baseline mental clarity required to actually execute the difficult tasks of environment design and habit stacking.
I absolutely love how the source from Anytime Fitness framed all of these interconnected habits. They created a countdown concept that acts as a perfect, rapid-fire synthesis of an idealized, neurologically optimized daily routine. Let's run through this countdown quickly, because it perfectly encapsulates the entire biological and behavioral ecosystem we have been discussing for the past hour.
It functions as an excellent, highly actionable mnemonic device for the listener to evaluate their own baseline systems.
Let's do it. Here is the Anytime Fitness Countdown.
Find 10 reasons to be genuinely grateful every day to suppress cortisol.
Take 9,000 steps a day to maintain physical circulation.
Drink 8 glasses or your body weight equivalent of water to maintain cognitive processing speed.
Crucial.
7. Get 7 to 8 hours of high-quality sleep to allow for synaptic pruning.
Spend 6 minutes engaging in deep meditation or mindfulness to train focus.
Eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables for cellular health.
Take 4 deliberate breaks during your workday to reset the prefrontal cortex.
Very important.
3. Eat 3 balanced protein-rich meals to maintain blood sugar.
Spend 2 hours entirely disconnected from your digital devices to allow your dopamine receptors to reset.
Dedicate 1 hour to physical exercise to boost neuroplasticity.
It is a phenomenal, comprehensive list that touches on every vital system. Sleep architecture, cellular hydration, micro habits, and overall cognitive resilience.
It is a great list, but I have to push back on the gratitude piece one last time before we wrap up.
Okay, what is it?
Because in modern internet culture, the demand for gratitude often morphs into something deeply unhelpful. It often sounds like toxic positivity.
Oh, the good vibes only movement.
Exactly. It sounds like a cliche bumper sticker telling people to just send good vibes and use gratitude as a way to blindly ignore systemic socioeconomic problems, legitimate workplace abuse, or genuine profound grief.
That is a very real danger, and it is a total perversion of what the clinical literature suggests. The science-based gratitude we are discussing today is absolutely not about ignoring real problems, denying your own suffering, or pretending everything is fine when your house is metaphorically on fire. Toxic positivity demands the suppression of negative emotion, which actually massively increases cortisol in the body.
Because you're fighting yourself.
Exactly. True. Science-based gratitude is a deliberate, highly targeted cognitive exercise. You are actively training your brain to trade spiraling, paralyzing thought patterns for calm, objective mental clarity. It is exactly like lifting weights. The gratitude muscle requires repetitive stress to grow stronger.
That makes perfect sense.
You are not using gratitude to ignore the storm outside. You are using gratitude to build a neurologically stronger shelter so that your prefrontal cortex can think clearly and rationally while the storm passes over you.
That is a beautiful and vital distinction. Science-based gratitude is a tool for building cognitive resilience, not a blindfold to hide from reality. So as we begin to synthesize everything we have uncovered, I mean, what an incredible, dense journey through the mechanics of human behavior.
It really has been.
We started by dismantling the myth of the overnight overhaul, proving the mathematics of micro-habits, and how 1% improvements can magically bypass our brain's resistance to high-effort tasks. We explored the literal physical wiring of our neurons, discovering how the brain ruthlessly prunes unused pathways and how we can graft new behaviors onto existing superhighways through the tactical use of habit stacking.
Yeah, the internal wiring.
And we acknowledge the immense, undeniable power of our external environment, learning to preload our decisions with implementation intentions and design our spaces to make the good choices the default. And finally, we grounded all of those complex mental tricks with the raw physiology required to run them. Optimizing our sleep temperatures to respect our circadian rhythm, hydrating our brain cells to prevent cardiovascular tension, and literally reshaping our emotional centers with the targeted practice of gratitude.
We have covered a massive amount of dense, interconnected neurological and psychological information today, which is why it is absolutely crucial to remind the listener right now, as they process all of this, you do not need to implement all of this tomorrow.
Exactly. Remember the foundational philosophy of the law of least effort. Do not attempt to overhaul your entire life tomorrow morning. That is exactly how you end up in the valley of disappointment.
Yes, pick just one.
Pick just one single microscopic atomic habit. Choose one action that takes exactly 30 seconds. Do 5 squats before you turn on the shower. Drink 1 glass of water the absolute second your feet hit the floor in the morning. Identify 1 paved highway in your brain and stack 1 tiny off-ramp onto it.
But before we completely sign off, I want to introduce one final, slightly dangerous concept from James Clear's research. It is something for you, the listener, to mull over as you begin the slow process of rebuilding your routines. We have spent an hour discussing how to survive the valley of disappointment and how to build these robust, permanent habits. But we haven't discussed what happens when you actually succeed.
Well, that sounds like an incredibly good problem to have. What is the danger in succeeding?
The danger is outlined in what Clear calls the Goldilocks rule.
The Goldilocks rule.
Right. The rule states that human beings experience peak levels of motivation when they are working on tasks that are situated right on the razor's edge of their current abilities. The task cannot be too overwhelmingly hard or we quit from frustration. It cannot be too effortlessly easy or we disengage completely.
It has to be just right.
It has to be just right. But here is the massive biological trap. As your new habits become deeply entrenched routines, they naturally become easier to execute. Because they are easier, they become significantly less interesting to the brain. Because they are less interesting, they become far less emotionally satisfying.
Wow.
Therefore, the greatest threat to your long-term success isn't failing to build the habit. The greatest threat is boredom.
Boredom is the ultimate enemy of the optimized brain.
Anyone can work hard and stay focused when they are highly motivated by the novelty of a brand new goal. But true professionals stick to the daily schedule even when the execution becomes mind-numbingly boring. And there is an even deeper philosophical trap hidden right within that boredom, the identity trap.
Oh, the identity shift we talked about earlier.
Yes. We spent significant time discussing how powerful it is to shift your mindset from an outcome to an identity, to firmly decide, I am a runner or I am a highly productive person. But Clear offers a really profound warning. The tighter we cling to an identity, the harder it becomes to grow beyond it.
So the very identity that saves you from the valley of disappointment in the beginning can eventually become the cage that prevents you from evolving later on.
Precisely. If you define yourself entirely by the specific habits that got you to where you are today, you will be neurologically incapable of abandoning them when they no longer serve you. Which leaves us with a necessary challenge for the listener. Once you successfully utilize all of these scientific tools to build the habits and forge the identity of the person you want to be today, will you possess the self-awareness and the courage to intentionally break those very same habits when it is time to become who you need to be tomorrow?
That is a wonderfully heavy, complex question to end on. You start this journey by looking in the mirror, trying to fix your daily routines like a shattered smartphone screen, desperately looking for that clean, overnight repair. But once you finally realize that you aren't a machine waiting for a software update, but rather a complex, deeply interconnected, constantly adapting biological ecosystem, you realize the work never really stops. You just get much better at tending the garden. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.